Chapter 8. Halifax by the Sea. It was 6:10 when we had found Jenkins, and our tickets were purchased. Then Jenkins must needs stow away his canine friend in the baggage car. It was then 6:20, but still the train waited. The engine was panting slowly, as if eager for the start. The engineer was leaning expectantly from his cab window. The fireman was making inroads upon the high-piled pine. But still the conductor sauntered leisurely up and down the platform, seemingly careless of the flight of the moments. 10 more minutes passed thus, and the passengers within the train began to grow uneasy. "Why are we waiting, White?" said I, nervously viewing the proceedings from the car platform. "Bus bringing important party," volunteered a nearby brakeman. Forthwith, rounding the corner just east of the depot, came a well-filled bus, the horses on the gallop, and our friend, the portly gentleman, much perturbed. "If you'd missed this train," ejaculated the latter, jumping to the pavement and shaking his fist angrily at the driver, "I'd have lost $200, and you'd have lost your job. I knowed they'd wait for us, seeing as you had that 'ere section in the Pullman, and seeing as you were going to take the boat at Miami." Somewhat soothed by this conciliatory address, the portly gentleman walked leisurely to his apartments in the rear of the train. The other passengers rushed frantically to their places, save for the negroes, who of course had gone in quietly and had remained obediently within their crowded domain, only betraying their curiosity by thrusting their woolly heads out of the window and rolling their dark eyes in response to the intelligence received from without. Once we were started, great was our sense of relief. On we rushed, the engineer striving by increased speed to make up for lost time. The puffings of the engine, which at first had been slow and distinct, now became one continuous roar. The cars creaked, rattled, and swayed. The smoke rolled in black volumes past the car window. On we sped, on through dark morasses with thick-growing cypress and water-oak, then out again upon the white sands of some upland region, with its sparse-growing pines and palmetto thickets. Now skirting an orange grove, arched by the great spreading arms of magnificent live oaks and pierced here and there by the straight shafts of feathery-topped palmettos. Here a glimpse of a villa, embowered in roses and half hidden by shrubbery. There a quaint white-pillared chapel, nestling among palms and surrounded by gravel walks. Here a river tortuously wandering amid tangled vegetation. There a lagoon mirroring the fast-sinking sun in its sluggish depths. A village, a group of idle loungers lolling on the platform of a ramshackle depot, and watching with lazy interest the swift-passing train. A cotton field, the workers singing and swinging their dinner buckets as they start homeward. Another landscape mellow and indistinct in the fast decreasing light. A more distinct roar from the engine, a louder rattle of wheels, a puff of murky smoke, a shower of cinders. The conductor had entered, followed by the trainmen, who quickly lighted the lamps. White presented the tickets for the 3 of us. The conductor looked at us searchingly, frowned, and seemed about to say something unpleasant. "Aren't the tickets good?" said I, apprehensively. "Yes," said the conductor, and passed on. An old lady across the aisle seemed to be in a disagreeable humor, and, judging by her gestures, had taken a particular aversion to us or someone near us. As the conductor was taking her ticket, she remarked, in a tone that was meant to be heard throughout that section of the car, "Some folks'll have to be learnt their place before they'll stay where they belong." "I think I'll ask the old shrew if there's anything about us that is distasteful to her," I whispered to White. But then, I don't blame her for disliking Jenkins' appearance. "Don't bother yourself," came the reply in an undertone. The conductor seemed to think that the least said was soonest mended, and perhaps we had better conduct ourselves in a similar fashion. "All right. But come, tell me something about our destination. Where and what is this Daytona for which we have purchased our tickets?" "Daytona is the nearest railroad station to our objective point. I learned that Halifax on the Beach is a favored camping and bathing resort. Charges reasonable, good hunting and fishing. I thought the ocean breeze might prove grateful to us until our trip is more perfectly planned. A tent and necessary cooking utensils, which I purchased in St. Augustine, are with our grips in the baggage car." Still we thundered on. The night grew dark without. Then a pale moon streamed its solemn light above the trees. "Daytona! Daytona!" shouted the brakeman and the conductor from opposite ends of the car almost simultaneously. A few moments of confusion, while the cries of porters and hackmen mingled with the hiss of escaping steam. Then we climbed into one of the waiting hacks, the hackman, meanwhile, muttering a choice collection of oaths anent the heaviness of some people's baggage. Taiga enjoyed the distinction of being tied to the back axle of the hack. A short drive through the deep white sand, with the new moon casting weird shadows all about us, brought us to a slight hillock, ascending which the roar of the waves suddenly burst upon our ears, and a moment later there lay before us, stretching far as eye could reach, the sea, majestically lifting its crests in the white moonlight. Its cooling breezes fanned away our weariness. "Hotel Halifax," announced the driver. "Here's where we'll stay until we choose a place to pitch our tent," announced White. "Unless," he added, addressing me, "unless you would rather spread the tent tonight." "No, thanks. I'm sleepy and hungry as an alligator." "You're getting acclimated already in your similes, I see. Well, let's go in, or rather, perhaps you had better go in while I tie up this refractory bundle and while Jenkins is untying his refractory dog." "A room for 3?" said the jolly hotel clerk. "Why, yes, I reckon so. Rest of party here?" White and Jenkins entered. The clerk scanned them narrowly. "I beg pardon, did you say room for 3?" "Yes." "Sorry, but our rules are very strict. You'd have to let your servant sleep in the servants' quarters. We can give 2 of you a room or a suite as you prefer." I had to laugh outright. It had often occurred to me that Jenkins' appearance was not prepossessing, but for him to be taken as a servant, well, I could scarcely recover from my laughing spell sufficiently to make it intelligible that Jenkins was not our serving man. The clerk did not appear satisfied. "Sorry, sir," he said finally, "but we're very much crowded now." I knew that he was lying, for the register showed very few names. My levity vanished in a moment. Angry at the implied insult, I replied, "Though we were 10 times as tired and hungry as we now are, we would not accept the accommodations of your hotel." "There's no other hotel nearby," suggested the clerk, but I feigned not to hear. "Come, White," said I, "there seems to be no other way but to tent out tonight." "All right. We might as well begin now as any time to rough it." Accordingly, we culled a lunch from our camping provisions, throwing a bite now and then to the dog, who seemed as hungry as any of his companions. On a site not far distant from the hotel grounds, we stretched out tent. Far into the night our axe rang out as it hewed and drove the driftwood stakes. Then, finally, Too exhausted to speak, we wrapped ourselves in our blankets and slept. A week sped quickly by. We hunted and fished, gathered oysters, searched for the curious shells, rare mosses and ferns. Surf bathing and an occasional row upon the river added relish to our stay. Gradually I began to become acquainted with some of the cottagers nearby. Some of the young people visited our tent occasionally to see our shell collection, or to bring an invitation for an evening's outing. White, however, seemed to prefer hunting to social engagements. I could not understand why one capable of being a social leader should not desire to shine in these social circles as he had done so frequently in the North. At length there came an especially urgent invitation to a moonlight sail along the Halifax. In it White was included, though none of the party had met him as yet. He had no excuse, which seemed sufficient to necessitate his remaining away, so he reluctantly gave his consent. Our toilet preparations were elaborate. Jenkins seemed especially desirous of making a good impression. So painstaking indeed was he that White and I had both completed our preparations and were nervously waiting for our tent mate when an unforeseen catastrophe occurred. Taiga was watching apprehensively as his master carefully adjusted his tie. A rabbit stole through the underbrush back of our tent. At a single bound, the dog was out of the tent, overturning in its exit a basin of wash water, and sadly bespattering Jenkins' linen. I had never seen Jenkins angry before. "The horrid brute!" he exclaimed, his face flushing, for the first time probably in many a year. Grabbing my rifle, he gave chase. Realizing that a tragedy was about to occur, White and I watched the proceeding from the tent door. For a few rods, Jenkins followed closely at the heels of Taiga. Then, as the palmetto thicket became more dense, seeming to realize the futility of his hunt, he returned, much dejected and bedraggled, to the tent. "We cannot wait longer for Jenkins," said I, glancing at my watch. "Why, it's time for the boat to start now. Come on, White, let's be gone at once." "No, I believe I'll wait for Jenkins." "I'm going to stay here, doggone it," announced Jenkins disappointedly. "Mr. White, I can take care of the tent alone." As White and I stepped aboard the boat a few moments later, I was rallied by several members of the party because of my tardiness. My apologies were profuse. I stated that a slight accident to Jenkins had detained us, and that we would not have come at all had we not thought that all the party would be waiting for us. Then, as the boat swung away from her moorings, I formally introduced White to the various members of the party. I could not help admiring his grace and courtesy while the formalities were in progress. He conversed fluently with those who sat nearest him, and seemed to be at his best. It soon became apparent, however, that the attitude of the company toward us was not the most cordial. "Did we keep you waiting long?" I asked of a dark-eyed damsel with whom I had considered myself pretty well acquainted. "No," distantly. "We were unavoidably detained." For answer there was silence. Then the dark-eyed damsel fell into lively conversation with a girl nearby, for whom I knew she had no liking. White and I then found ourselves sitting apart, while the others jested and whispered among themselves. I had a vague suspicion that some of the jests were at our expense. Music came as a relief to our embarrassment. A mandolin, guitar, and many voices joined in familiar airs. Way down upon the Swanee River mingled with some rollicking college songs. Then the instruments struck up the Virginia reel, to which one young blood insisted upon dancing, despite the boatman's orders to the contrary. For this he paid dearly. When, in his varied evolutions, he approached the side of the boat, the yard arm swung around suddenly, striking him a stinging blow in the chest, and seating him with more ease than grace upon his lady's lap. There was naturally much merriment for a time, at the expense of the unfortunate youth. By and by, some patriotic maiden started Maryland, My Maryland, and then it was only natural that Dixie should be the next choice. In this, all joined with more enthusiasm than had greeted any other song. I was astonished at the wave of feeling that swept down upon this little company and bore them high upon its bosom, as they sang this hymn so dear to the Southern heart. Again and again they sang the chorus until all were too tired or too hoarse to sing it more. "Oh, Sue, can't you recite something for us?" chorused a number of girls. After some demur, a tall brunette leaned forward, so as to command a view of all in the boat, and began, "In southern seas there is an isle where earth and sky forever smile, where storms cast not their sombre hue upon the welkin's holy blue, where clouds of blessed incense rise from myriad flowers of myriad dyes, and strange bright birds glance through the bowers like mingled stars or mingled flowers. Oh, dear one, would it were our lot to dwell upon this lovely spot, to stray through woods with blossoms starred, bright as the dream of seer or bard, to hear each other's whispered words mid the wild notes of tropic birds, and deem our lives in these bright bowers one glorious dream of love and flowers." "Beautiful! Exquisite!" commented some of the girls. "Can't you give us something sort of cooling? I'm warm," said Larry, the dancer. Another laugh was enjoyed at the expense of Larry. "Why," answered the brunette, "there's a little poem I wrote the first time I ever saw snow. It was when I was up north on a visit last winter." "Good," said Larry. "Give it," echoed several others. "Let me see. It is entitled Old Boreas." "Oh, this is the time when old Boreas roars and rattles the windows and shakes at the doors. He gathers the snow in his dark shaggy mane, and then, with a whisk, shakes it all out again, while often at night you awaken with fear, and shuddering list to his roaring so near. Aha, laughs old Boreas, winter is here. Then stir up the embers, and let them not die. Yes, pile on the logs till the red flames leap high. Then draw up a chair to the warm fire's glow, and list to a tale of the days long ago, while grandfather tells you adventures of old, while fancy's fond pictures in embers you mold. Aha, you laugh, Boreas, come with your cold." The rest of the sail was enlivened by conundrums and small talk in which White and I took no part. I had hoped that, with the singing and general merrymaking, the stiffness would gradually wear away, but it did not, and I was heartily glad when we were in our tent again. Neither of us spoke as we were preparing for sleep. For some time I tossed about, trying to compose my mind after we had retired, but finding my efforts were vain, I finally blurted out, "White, I can't imagine what made those folks so icy cold all of a sudden. It must be something besides our tardiness." "Oh, don't bother your head longer about it," said White sleepily. "I knew the habit I have of queering things, and you didn't. I'm sorry on your account that I went." "Not so fast there, old man. I won't hear you talk thus of yourself. Your manner was as genial and your conversation as refined as that of a—" "Ward politician?" suggested White. "Yes, a successful politician," laughed I. "But I know that there must have been some misunderstanding back of all this strange conduct, and I mean to find out tomorrow what it is." Well, it's almost tomorrow now, so you had better go to sleep. Good night. Good night. We lingered another week at the coast, and the attitude of the social world did not change. There were clam bakes, bathing parties, tally-ho rides. There were dainty tea parties and lawn fetes, without the lawn, for Florida sand and salt spray are not productive of lawns. But to none of these were we invited. I worried, and White said I was growing thin. I addressed many a spirited polemic to myself and tent-mates upon the confounded obstinacy of some folks. I questioned some of the young people whom I chanced to meet, but got only evasive answers. White looked grave. Jenkins sulked. Then, at the end of the week of disappointment, White suggested that perhaps we had remained long enough at the seashore, a suggestion which received my hearty second, and Jenkins's silence gave consent. At Daytona, Jenkins suddenly brightened. "Doggone it, I'm going home," he announced. "I never did like the South, and never shall." "Oh, don't be in a hurry," said White. "We'll have better fortune now. In the interior we expect to get a shot at some wildcats, and perhaps a bear or two can be found to try Taiga's mettle." Jenkins shook his head dolefully. "I fear Taiga never will make a good hunter." When the train pulled out, we left Jenkins and Taiga on the depot platform. The former waved his hand. The latter barked a hearty farewell. After a long sigh, I said, "What a relief! We're rid of both of them." "Yes," said White, "but do you know that I feel sorry for Jenkins? Poor fellow! If he would only get some work of his size and stick to it, he'd be all right." End of Section 8. Chapter 9. Camp Life. After a 3-hour ride on the train, we took passage on a riverboat. A romantic trip it was along the winding Ocklawaha, rounding seemingly impossible curves, plying in and out among encroaching debris. The journey at night was fascinating and weird because of the wildness of the surroundings and the strange freaks of the moonlight. But by day, the scenes were beyond parallel. On we went, past shadowy depths of dark foliage, on past giant trees which all but locked their moss-enshrouded arms across the stream. Over our heads the towering and tenebrous boughs of the cypress met in a dusky arch, and the trailing mosses, high in air, waved like banners that hang on the walls of ancient cathedrals. Longfellow's Evangeline. Our camp was pitched on one of the pine uplands abutting on a shadowy lagoon. Here we hunted and fished, content with our solitary life and the simple diet furnished by gun and rod. Our sylvan life gave opportunity for thought, and very naturally my mind turned toward that which, a short time before, had engrossed so much of my time and thought. I longed for the opportunity to see Mr. Esson and go over the details of the flight and capture of the young mulatto I had tried to befriend. One circumstance which Mr. Esson had recorded in his letter inspired me with hope, although I must confess that it was somewhat of a forlorn hope. That was the fact that the overseer was not satisfied regarding the mulatto's death. His words, "I will travel from ocean to ocean and from pole to pole until I am assured of the death or capture of the Negro and his accomplice," kept ringing through my mind. Somewhere, then, this overseer was searching for the unfortunate roustabout. Suddenly there flashed over me the conviction that I had seen the overseer somewhere since that memorable afternoon upon the wharf. I pondered over this conviction for some time, but seemed to be unable to give myself a satisfactory reason for it. The whole subject was so much in my mind that I decided to speak of it to White. Accordingly, one night, as we lay stretched out before our campfire after a hard day's hunt, I broached the subject to him. I spared not a single detail, reciting even those incidents of the flight when I was ignominiously neglectful of my duty toward my ward. White's face was shaded by his hat during most of the monologue to which I treated him. But when he looked up at the close of my story, his face was full of sympathy. "Harold," said he, for the first time calling me by my first name, "Harold, we'll run across that young roustabout some of these days. I'm quite of your opinion that the overseer must—" "Hold!" said I, interrupting. "I have another revelation. Even as you speak, there flashes before me the solution of a problem that has been bothering me all day. Yes, for several days. Stanton, you also have seen this overseer. You saw him commencement day. He was treated as our guest of honor. He was none other than the traveling man that was mistaken for our college benefactor." "Ah!" exclaimed White excitedly. "Then he is still of the opinion that you and the roustabout are above the sod." "Yes, and it isn't the most comfortable thing in the world to consider that he came so very near finding me. I'd like pretty well to see Mr. Esson. I've no doubt that he knows more of this matter than he revealed in his letter." "We shall doubtless be able to call there before we return, if you desire it so much. We must not lose sight of the fact, however, that we have other objects which are of some importance. You know this is to be an outing for both of us, so we must not let worry defeat this purpose. Again, we are to study at first hand the social conditions of the Negro, and are to try to discover means for the uplift of this race. Finally, we are to notice as we travel some of the resources of the South which would commend it as a haven for the home-seeker and a place for the investment of Northern capital." For 2 weeks longer we remained complacently at the place where the little river steamer had left us. We looked not on the face of man. Then a sudden dread laid hold on me. The very silence of the forest, broken only by the hoot of owl or the cry of wild beast, became oppressive to me. "Stanton," said I finally, "some people may enjoy solitude, but I was not cut out for an ascetic. If I am to die, I wish to die immersed in life, not in desolation. I didn't know that you were even ill, not to mention dying. You never looked heartier in your life. Outdoor life surely agrees with you." "No, I'm not sick, only at heart. Just think of the thousands of cities in this world, with their innumerable workshops and factories, their chimneys belching smoke, their blast furnaces lurid with flames, their machinery rushing and roaring, their employees toiling amid the dust and din and darkness, bending all their energies toward producing something of material benefit to the world. The humblest workman is a sharer in the great mechanism of life. He takes up the material that another has fitted for his hand. He fashions it for yet another's hand, thus filling a small place among his fellow workmen, as well as in the great workaday world. But think of us, away out here in a trackless forest, completely out of touch with our fellow beings. Oh, I am not afraid. You needn't think that. I was afraid when we first came here. Uncanny forebodings laid hold upon me. Now all that is gone. In the silence of the night, I am sometimes awakened with the thought that I'm back again among the activities of life, back at home or back in some city, back with a purpose to be of some use in the world, to accomplish something that is worth while. I'm sick and tired of being useless." "I'm mighty glad to hear you say that," said White smilingly. "Yet we must be cautious lest the brain and heart outrun the physical powers." "Bother caution! I tell you we must move, or I'll simply burn up desiring to be rid of this kind of existence." "All right, we'll strike tent today. I most thoroughly sympathize with your desire to have a share in the world's work. I believe that this spirit of dissatisfaction with our present lot is a divinely implanted spirit. Thereby, if you will pardon me for seeming to moralize for a moment, thereby we are prompted to continual advancement. We cannot gain the highest satisfaction unless we know that the task in hand is worthy of the greatest expenditure, the highest motive. I believe, Harold, that you will be given such a task." White had scarcely finished his sermonette when there was a sound of snapping twigs near our tent. Jumping to our feet, we waited the approach of the intruder with our rifles in readiness. A human form stepped out from behind a tree and advanced toward us, then halted as we brought our guns to our shoulders. Perceiving this alarm, we bade him stand and give an account of himself. He was an old, gray-bearded Negro, unarmed save for the axe he carried upon his shoulder. His garments were patched. His shoes were evidently intended for someone else. An old felt hat, which doubtless at some time had possessed some distinctive form, but now had degenerated into an irregular, conical covering for the back of his head, was pushed up from a broad, wrinkled brow. As soon as he could recover his voice, he stammered, "For the law's sake, gemmen, don't shoot a po' harmless old nigger." I judged that the loss of his front teeth caused his lisp. "That's all right," said Stanton reassuringly. "We are just campers and won't hurt you. Where do you live?" "Over there, Peace." "Peace," said he, pointing southward. "Good," I replied. "We'll pack our tent in a hurry and have you show us the way out of these woods." "That just what we all could do," said the Negro, seemingly much relieved by the thought of some work ahead. "Ha, ha, yaw!" he guffawed. "I done thought my time had come for show." He then went off into a series of chuckles and grimaces from which he did not recover until Stanton recalled him to the present by bidding him lend assistance at packing our belongings. It was marvelous what activity the old Negro possessed, and in an incredibly short time the tent and the satchels were ready. For 3 hours we walked through a maze of timberland and undergrowth, then gradually emerged into a clearing in the midst of which stood a diminutive cabin with a lean-to woodshed in the rear. The sides of the cabin were of rough pine boards, weather-beaten and warped, placed upright, and having the intervening cracks covered by lath, which evidently dated from a later period. At one end of the cabin was a huge brick chimney rising several feet above the palmetto-thatched roof. The building boasted a front door and one window. About 10 feet in front of the door was a large orange tree, in the shade of which several children were playing. The two smallest had no encumbrance in the way of clothing. A girl of about 5 and a boy of 8 were clad in the conventional garb I had noticed many times before in the South. It consisted of a burlap bag in which holes for the neck and arms had been cut out, and which was curtailed to suit the length of the wearer, it being considered good form to have the body covered nearly to the knees. All this I observed in passing. I noticed also a red-turbaned woman standing by a great stump beyond the orange tree. By the stump stood a wash-tub of clothes, evidently belonging to some well-to-do family. The turbaned woman was taking the clothes dripping from the tub and, laying them upon the stump, pounded them lustily with a large wooden paddle. "That's a Southern washboard," said Stanton, pointing to the stump. A coal-black lad of perhaps 12 years now broke away from the group under the orange tree, and came running toward the old Negro, calling as he came, "Oh, Grandpap, where's yo' going?" Then, not waiting for reply, "Lemme tote yo' axe, Grandpap. I done wished I had guns so I could go hunting. Lots of rabbits round here. I done see 'em all the time. Grandpap, you gimme gun, den I come along and see rabbit and go bang." This he illustrated by citing along both hands. "I see squirrel up in tree and go bang. I see gator down in swamp and go bang. I see wildcat and go bang. I see cow and go bang, and the cow jump 10 feet. I shoot bad nigger. I bring home wild turkey. He good with hoe cake." His eyes shone as he held up an imaginary dainty morsel, and then, after sundry loud smacks, swallowed it with evident relish. On he prattled without a moment's respite. "Grandpap, just feel my arm. I soon be big man. I'll be a knocker. I'll fight in the ring, and I'll knock every witchly person. They can't stand up against me. Here come long big nigger. I just go pop with my arm and he fall down. Here come white trash. I just go pop and knock him over. Here come man and give me lots of money, $10,100 perhaps. You go along, you Samuel." "Samuel," said the old Negro, growing tired of the boy's prattle. "Oh, y'all's going to Mr. Essen's? I know, and I won't go along too." At the mention of Mr. Essen's name, White started and gave me a searching look, but evidently reading the surprise in my face, he said nothing. Samuel chattered on, unheeded, until we paused in front of a large, much-veranded house, retiring amid luxuriant shrubbery. "We shall not trouble you further," said Stanton to the old Negro. "If you will but tell us the best path to the nearest village where we may replenish our food supplies and rest a little during the heat of the day." "No town near here, and y'all can rest here at the house." End of Section 9. Chapter 10. Plantation Life. A gentleman walked leisurely down from the house and approached us from a blossom-lined path. "How now, Uncle Boston? We have visitors, I see," he exclaimed cheerily as he came forward and extended a hand to each of us. "My name is Essen, as I suppose Uncle Boston has told you. Come right up to the piazza and have chairs in the shade. You are from the north, I presume?" "Why, yes," I replied. Noting the evident embarrassment of White, I did not introduce myself or companion, but simply remarked, "We're campers, and we wish to inquire the way to the nearest town, that we might replenish our food supply." "I myself used to live in the north," proceeded Mr. Essen, evading my question. "And I assume that anyone from there is a welcome visitor. Just step up to the porch, gentlemen. Boston, you and Samuel can have your dinner here with the servants, and then you can go to work in the clearing." Samuel's eyes danced at the mention of dinner, and he turned 2 handsprings in the direction of the kitchen before he noticed that Uncle Boston was being detained. "Boston," said Mr. Essen severely, "how was the bark peeled off these orange trees? It looks as if someone had driven through the yard with a wagon, and the hub had struck the trees." "Dat jeth what it looketh," said Uncle Boston, nodding his head emphatically. "Yes," continued Mr. Essen, looking down at the ground, "here are buggy tracks. Dat the track of a buggy sure enough. These are the tracks of the horse. Rather large tracks. Must have been a large horse. It couldn't have been old man Hopkins' horse." "Couldn't have been," echoed Boston. "I'll tell you, Boston. I believe it was Squire White and his gray mare." "Dat who done it for sure," exclaimed Uncle Boston, striking his thigh and speaking with such assurance as to cause Mr. Essen to look up in surprise. "Did you see him, Boston?" "No, sah, but that am who surely done it. He done taught we all not know." And Boston went off into a series of chuckles from which he did not recover until Mr. Essen had ordered him back to the servants' apartments. "It is rather unusual that anyone should drive in any sort of vehicle through here," remarked Mr. Esson, when we all three had seated ourselves upon the piazza. "But if it was Squire White, I believe his action was for spite. You see, the squire lives alone upon the next plantation, and a very common condition in Florida is illustrated by our 2 plantations. My soil is, for the most part, rich hummock land, while his, though adjacent to mine, is all but worthless upland. It usually happens that the northerner buys the upland, either sight unseen or upon the recommendation of some real estate dealer. In this case, the tables are turned. Squire White lost all of his property soon after the Civil War, and he has not yet obtained sufficient funds to make much outlay in real estate. He bought this land, 200 acres in all, at an auction where it was sold for taxes. He has built himself a very snug little home from timber cut on his place, and combined with his pettifogging, he does a little market gardening, so that he is not in want. We have continued to be very good neighbors until about a month ago. Just about a month ago, when I was in the city, I saw some magazines which I thought the squire would like. I made arrangements to have them sent regularly to his address. This I did because I pitied his loneliness and wished, as you understand, to do him a real service. He went to the city and found out who sent the magazines, and I shall never forget in what a frenzy he rode up to my door that evening. I verily believe that if he had been armed, he'd have shot me dead. He took it as an insult to his family name that I should parade his indignance before a stranger in a distant city. Said he, "I may have the misfortune, sir, to be poor as far as money is concerned, but I'd have you understand that the best blood of the South flows in my veins." Then, before I realized what he was about, he was naming with evident pride his ancestry through the Lees back to Washington. My seeming indifference to the efficacy of such an argument angered him still more, and in spite of my repeated assurances that I meant no offense, he has ever since shown me how obnoxious one neighbor can be to another. I sent Boston with a note the other day requesting the return of some borrowed garden implements which I needed greatly. The squire threw an axe at him and bade him never appear on his premises again, on peril of his life. This barking of my choice orange trees is something of which I was not aware until just now. It must have been done last night. I beg your pardon, gentlemen, for thus introducing you at once into an altercation, but I confess that I am somewhat vexed by this last token of my neighbor's displeasure. "I'm very sure, sir," said Stanton, speaking with dignity, "that we wish for an early and happy settlement of so unfortunate a misunderstanding. I am not surprised, however, at your tale, for I have spent some little time in the South and could tell you many a similar story. To be frank, I believe that Southern pride can be wounded much more easily now than several years ago, because the Southerner is likely to attribute the slights he now receives to his misfortunes in and following the great civil struggle. I feel that the South has suffered much, perhaps more than we can ever realize, and I believe that we should exercise the utmost of patience and charity toward its people. The wounded bodies of the boys in gray have long since healed. Not so their wounded pride. Some of them have drifted from a sense of definite injury to a state of morbid sensitiveness, which will require the most delicate handling. The South has begun to learn, however, that family name and distinguished ancestry will not answer for hard work and genuine worth in democratic America." "Your words reveal a better understanding of Southern life than your youthfulness would lead me to expect. I am glad that your more mature judgment has led you to share my views. Seeing your interest in this subject, I'd like to inquire what you think ought to be done with the American Negro." "Well, well," said our host, looking amused, "I had no idea that my acquiescence to what you just said would lay upon me the burden of answering a question that is engrossing the time and skill of our leading educators, philanthropists, and statesmen. I fear that I'd have to ask that you first state your question a little differently. I feel that what we are going to do with the American Negro is not so pertinent as what we are going to do for him, and what he is going to do for himself. He is here. He has become a permanent part of our population. The question is not of deportation, but of uplift. I see, however, that we shall not have time to discuss this matter further, for here come my little girls to remind us that the dinner hour has arrived. Stanton and I glanced up to see not the small maidens whom we had anticipated seeing, but two tall, beautiful girls, followed by the inevitable small brother. "I must beg your pardon, gentlemen. I have not yet learned your names. So interested have I been in discussing other matters with you." "My name is Stanton White, and this is Harold Edson." "Indeed! Why, Mr. Edson, why didn't you write me that you were coming? Afraid you'd disappoint me the second time, were you? Well, I'm glad you've come. Both of you are most welcome. Mr. Edson and Mr. White, this is my daughter, Miss Irma." The taller one of the two, a blonde with expressive blue eyes, advanced and cordially greeted us. "And this is my second daughter, Miss Zoe," continued our host, as a vivacious brunette smilingly accosted us. So captivating were the smiles that I scarcely noticed little Alan, a lad of 6, clad in a linen sailor suit, and his fair face wreathed in a wealth of yellow ringlets. The lad, however, seemed to unconsciously win his way into our hearts, and in a moment he had taken my hand and was explaining all about his pets and plans. Without delay we were ushered into the dining-room, and were seated to a sumptuous repast. "You see, my little girls have to act as housekeepers since their mother was taken away 5 years ago. Irma takes care of the house, while Zoe plans the meals. Of course they have help. Uncle Boston's nephew has a little house in the rear, and the whole tribe of Bostons help with the heavy work." Although I could not recall much of the table conversation, for a part in which I seemed to have no time, so good did the roast chicken and sweet potatoes taste after our camping experience, I remembered afterward that it was both refined and engaging. The girls were evidently well informed, and the little lad was cram full of amusing expressions and affectionate ways. Even the cook showed the special favor in which Alan was held by sending him a little pie, which the child insisted upon dividing with everyone at the table. Dinner over, Mr. Esson conducted us to the library, while the girls busied themselves with the dishes. I was not entirely prepared to see such a library. Shelf rose above shelf along one whole side of the room. The best classic literature and many books of reference were there. A set of textbooks, such as might have been in use in the best colleges 25 years before, occupied one section of the library. I opened one of them, and on the flyleaf read, "Silas P. Esson, Yale, 18 blank." "Quite a while since you were at Yale," I said more to myself than to my host. "It seems but a few years ago when I was playing the old rugby game," he faltered in a disquieted fashion. He lit a cigar and puffed at it nervously for a moment, then threw it aside and excused himself from the room. "Evidently," said White, "his remembrance of college days is not so pleasant as ours." Mr. Esson returned in a few moments, and during the remainder of the afternoon he proved himself so companionable that it was nearly sunset when we became aware of the flight of time. Then the two young ladies appeared clad in white, and proposed that we all should go for a row upon the neighboring bayou. This invitation we were not loath to accept, and loosing a little skiff from beneath a gnarled cottonwood tree, we rowed leisurely down the little bayou until it expanded into a dark, shadowy lagoon, on whose shores I recognized our former camping place. Then back we came just as darkness wrapped us in her embrace. After supper, we formed so merry a group upon the piazza that White seemed to forget that he had objected to being the guest of an unknown man. With laughter, jest, and song, the evening sped quickly. Not a suggestion was there of that coldness which fell upon another group one moonlight evening not long before. End of Chapter 10. Section 11 of Stanton White, A Romance of the New South, by Asa Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hunting the Alligator. Morn broke fair and cloudless. The mockingbirds waked the sun with their glad madrigals. From the topmost boughs of many a tree they poured a stream of music until all the air was thrilling with sweet melody. Cardinals, jays, and red-winged blackbirds thronged the tree-tops and shook the dew from many a leafy shrub. The calm of a restful night was upon us. We knew not what was forthcoming, but all nature was so glorious that no shadow fell upon our mental horizon. I began to whistle and then to sing a love ditty with such an astounding earnestness that Stanton hushed me lest my sonorous vibrations should waken the other occupants of the house. For it was yet early, and Stanton recognized my musical limitations. Our precautions, however, were unnecessary, for a moment later the breakfast bell rang. White and I were more prompt than Mr. Essen in appearing at the breakfast table. The latter excused his tardiness by stating that he had not heard the bell. He looked worn and jaded, as if he had passed a restless night. He ate little and failed to respond to any of the small talk of the table. "Mr. Edson," said our host when we were again in the library, "it is very fortunate that you young gentlemen came just at this time. If it suits your convenience, you can supply a much-felt need in our household. It is natural that I should desire for my children the best of schooling, but you know what these Florida schools are. I once heard a noted educator state that the Florida children run with their teacher for 5 months and with the calves for 7 months, and they unlearn more while with the calves for 7 months than they learn in the 5 months with the teacher. It has therefore come to pass that wealthier residents of the state send their children to private schools, and instead of trying to bring the public schools up to the standard of their requirements, they relegate the public schools to those who are too poverty-stricken to afford anything different, or too illiterate and indifferent to desire anything better. Wishing to hold myself aloof from patronizing either the public or private schools in their present condition, I myself have tutored my children. I realize, however, that many things have changed since I went to college. The girls should have better training than that which their father can give them. Accordingly, if they desire it, I mean to send them to some first-class Northern college. Before they can enter such an institution, it will be necessary to bring their knowledge up to date, in the accomplishment of which I shall be most happy to have your assistance. In the meantime, the estate is before you. Choose your own pastimes and haunts. Anything you see is yours. For today, I propose an alligator hunt. I know of a swamp about 4 miles from here where I think we can find some gators. I'll have Uncle Boston hitch the horse to the spring wagon, and we'll be off before the sun is hot." "Papa, can I go?" Thus said the fair-haired boy who had been listening intently until now. "Why, I don't know. If Mr. White and Mr. Edson think that you won't be in the way—" "Certainly. Let 'em go," said Stanton quickly. "It's not so long since I was a boy." Allen looked his gratitude. The arrangements for the hunt were soon perfected. An hour's ride along a deep sanded road brought us to a swamp surrounded by water oaks. The approach to the swamp was difficult because of the deep slime, but the boat was soon launched by Uncle Boston, who waded deep into the slime and paved the way for those who followed by throwing down some loose boards. Then he went to stay with the horse while the rest of us embarked. Around and around the swamp we went, prodding everywhere in the soft ooze with our long-handled spears. The swamp was nearly traversed, and no excitement rewarded us. I was becoming skeptical as to the presence of alligators in the swamp when I felt my spear graze something hard and rough. Immediately there was a quick movement in the water, and the chase had begun. Ripples showed Stanton where to guide the boat, while Mr. Essen and I thrust here and there with our spears. More swiftly we went, the gator swimming so smoothly that its position was judged with the utmost difficulty. "I hit him! I hit him! I've got him foul!" cried Mr. Essen excitedly. The boat quivers as if agitated by an earthquake. The water boils and rises in great waves. No need for oars now. Mr. Essen holds to his spear as if for dear life. The boat whirls and shoots to the other end of the pool as if traversing a race course. Then, turning abruptly, it flashes back again. The terrific speed suddenly slackens. "Look out for him! He's torn loose!" shouts Mr. Essen. The words are scarcely uttered when the head of the infuriated reptile appears at the side of the boat, dangerously near to Allen. The boy seizes an oar, and before anyone realizes the danger, he coolly aims a blow at the brute's head. A crash. The oar is wrenched from his grasp with such violence as to drag him over the side of the boat. Mr. Essen tries to rescue his boy, but too late. Sharp teeth crunch the lad's shoulder. With a never-to-be-forgotten look of terror, Allen struggles with his foe. A flash from Stanton's rifle, and the water is dyed with blood. Alligator and boy disappear from view. Mr. Essen and I sat for an instant, as if paralyzed. Not so Stanton. His jaw was firmly set. His eyes were riveted upon the spot where the boy sank. Flinging his rifle aside, he tore off his coat and grasped his hunting knife in his teeth. "Hold!" thundered Mr. Essen, detecting White's purpose. Stanton heeded him not. A sunny head appeared above the surface a little in front of the boat. Quick as thought, Stanton changed the direction of his leap, and a moment later both Stanton and the boy were safe within the boat. At that moment, I noticed that no less than 5 pairs of eyes were watching us from the water. "Quick!" said Mr. Essen, rousing himself from the contemplation of the pale face and motionless form. "Quick, or they'll overturn the boat!" I seized the remaining oar, and Stanton assisted with the butt of his rifle, so that without delay we were ashore. The blood was oozing from a dozen cruel teeth marks in the lad's shoulder when we laid him white and limp in the shade of a tree beside the swamp, while Uncle Boston was dispatched on horseback for the nearest doctor, 3 miles distant. Stanton at once gave attention to the boy. I stood and watched, not knowing what else to do. There appeared no flutter of the breath to reassure us. The father was busy chafing the limbs and rolling the boy from side to side. Putting the father gently aside, with a reassuring, "I'll bring him to if there is any life in him," Stanton quickly turned the lad upon his face, and placing one hand beneath the pale forehead, with the other he brought the tongue forward and thus freed the mouth of a quantity of muddy water. Then, turning him upon his back again, he tore open the clothing around the lad's neck. As the father resumed chafing the cold limbs, Stanton brought the arms quickly along the ground to the shoulder level. The bone of the injured arm grated in its socket. Stanton examined the shoulder narrowly. "Nasty fracture of the acromion," he muttered beneath his breath. However, we shall have to keep on moving the arms at the risk of complications. 15 minutes gone. The eyes looked staring. No movement of eyelids, no flutter of breath. The lines of anxiety deepened in the father's face. Neither man relaxed his efforts. 20 minutes gone. A forlorn hope seemed to vanish into despair for the father. Wearied by his exertions, he buried his head in his hands dejectedly. He was roused by Stanton bidding him wrap the body in his own coat and in as many others as he could find. Still, the rhythmical movement of the arms intermitting with pressure upon the chest. "Bring cold water from the jug in the wagon and dash it in his face," said Stanton to me, not relaxing his efforts. "Then dry his face briskly," he added, as I hastened to obey. 25 minutes gone, and still no sign of life. The rhythmical movement was slightly increased in rapidity. Stanton now added to his other restorative efforts, blowing his own breath into the lad's mouth as he raised the arms. A slight quivering of the nostrils, a convulsive gasp, a faint shade of color mounted to the marble cheek, and thence to the forehead. Though at first intermittent and weak, as the efforts of the watchers were continued, the breathing became more steady, the blue eyes opened for an instant, and the pallid lips murmured, "Papa?" Then, as if exhausted, he sank into a calm sleep from which he was not awakened until the doctor arrived. "Well, well, Essen," said the doctor, throwing himself from his foaming steed. "I feared by what Uncle Boston told me that the boy would be beyond reach when I arrived. Nasty place, these swamps, for anyone to get hurt. So much poison mixed up with the water and air that any accident is likely to be followed by a long spell of fever. Whew! Rather bad fracture of the acromion, and the body of the scapula much comminuted." "So Mr. White here seemed to observe," said Mr. Essen gravely. Dr. McPhail scanned Stanton narrowly. "You resuscitated him?" "Yes," said Stanton, and then added apologetically, "I worked for a year as orderly in a Philadelphia hospital." "You've saved his life," said the doctor admiringly. Mr. Essen seemed to grow 10 years younger in that moment. End of section 11. Chapter 12. Shadows. At home, everything possible was done for the comfort of the suffering one. The girls, though at first alarmed by the accident, soon recovered poise and self-possession. Not so Mr. Essen. He did not appear at the breakfast table the following morning. Late in the afternoon, he came down and languidly seated himself in the parlor. The doctor, who was just making his visit, paused for a moment to give what seemed an admonition, and then, handing a bottle to Miss Irma, he gave his orders in a louder tone than I considered necessary, as I sat watching the procedure from the library. "Your father is to take 1 spoonful of this tonic every 2 hours until his nerves are better, and on no account is he to keep his room. He should be much out of doors and should seek the companionship of others." Miss Irma looked troubled. Following the doctor out upon the piazza, she carried on a whispered conversation for some moments. Stanton also left the bedside of the boy long enough to speak a few hurried words to the doctor just as he drove away. It was as Dr. McPhail had feared. The deadly fever was upon the child, and, as Stanton afterward told me, the doctor entreated him to assume control of the household during this trying time, because it was feared that Mr. Essen was incapable of doing so. Shortly after the doctor's departure, Uncle Boston returned from the swamp, bringing the skin and teeth of a monstrous alligator. The girls had been too much absorbed in the need of the passing moment to ask the details of the tragedy of the previous day. But now they listened attentively to Uncle Boston's naive and graphic story, which he emphasized here and there by jerky gestures and rolling eyes. "And dith morning," said he, concluding his tale by an explanatory jerk of his thumb toward the hide and the teeth in the wagon, "dith morning, when I done gone to the thwamp, hear what dith gemman drawn up on the thide of the water. "Dat bullet of Mr. White make his head too heavy, and he can't tote it round no more. Den he lie down for a long rest." The old negro's usual series of chuckles was checked by Miss Zoe. "Take them away, Uncle Boston," said she, indicating with an impatient gesture the trophies of the hunt, "for it may be that those cruel teeth shall prove to be the death of my brother and my father." That evening a dead silence seemed to settle down upon the group around the supper table. Aunt Sarah, Uncle Boston's wife, sat with the boy while the rest of us ate. All hurried through the meal, with the exception of myself. I alone seemed to be unperturbed. As Stanton was about to rise from the table, Mr. Esson laid a detaining hand upon him. "I'd like to see you for a moment on the piazza," said he, in a voice that trembled in spite of its owner's effort to appear nonchalant. The conversation lasted for more than the time indicated by our host, and when Stanton returned, his chin was firmly set, and his eye was bright with the light of resolve. For several days I did not have an opportunity to ask what the momentous fact was which so sobered Stanton. But when I did ask, he put me off with, "I'll tell you sometime, old man, when you can be of service. It's a sorry business now, and everything seems to depend upon the recovery of the boy. Harold, I don't know whether you ever pray, but if you do, pray that the boy may be spared, for 2 lives depend upon his recovery." The days wore wearily on. The fair face of the boy was flushed, his eyes heavy. At times, in wild delirium, he went over the events of the day when he was injured. "We'll catch him yet. Watch me hit him in the head." Then, as his face assumed that never-to-be-forgotten expression, with wide-open eyes, he grappled with an unseen foe. "Save me!" he would cry in agonizing earnestness, attempting to rise from the pillow. And then, as Stanton's hand was placed soothingly on his heated brow, he'd sink back exhausted, murmuring, "Take me home. Please take me home." "It's too bad," said Stanton to me in our room one evening, after the fever had raged unabated for several days. "I'm afraid that the lad is going to slip away from us in spite of all we can do. This Dr. McPhail is doing his best, I believe, and he is a fine fellow. I like him, but these Southern doctors, graduates of Southern colleges, or else not graduates at all, as is the case with this doctor, are taught the use of only a few drugs, calomel, quinine, and strychnia. These they give in heroic doses, and what cannot be cured must be endured. If I but had some of the remedies used in the Philadelphia hospital where I worked, I believe that with my limited knowledge of therapeutics, I'd stand a good chance of pulling the lad through." "If you know so well what to give him, why don't you telegraph to St. Augustine or some other neighboring city and get the medicine?" "Well, if I had known what a serious time we were to have, I would surely have suggested some such plan to the family. But now I fear it is too late. The crisis will be tonight, and if he does not begin to mend by morning, all medical assistance will be of no avail." "Well, Stanton, in such a case as this, I really don't see what good prayers will do. I think less praying and more skill would work better than more praying with the present skill employed." Stanton shook his head. "Yes, that is often the way it appears to me. But many a time, with the utmost of skill employed, a patient slips away down the dark path, and again a patient who seems to be just as sick as the other one gets well in spite of everything that bungling doctors can do to hinder it. Truly, our lives seem at times to be suspended by a thread, and God alone can tell when that thread is to snap. Our times are in His hands," he quoted reverently. After a long pause, he continued, "Harold, we've never prayed together, although I am sure that you know of my faith in prayer. In this hour of need, let us both kneel, and if you care to voice a petition, I'll wait for you." Stanton waited until the silence became oppressive, and then proceeded. O Thou, with whom is the power of life and death, we come to Thee tonight. Having exhausted human resources, we cast ourselves upon Thy mercy. Strengthen us for the hard demands that will come upon us, and if it shall please Thee to give back to the circle of those who love Him the fair young life which now hangs in the balance, we shall give Thee all the praise. Amen. One thing more, Harold, continued Stanton, pausing with his hand upon the doorknob. Before I go down to the long watch of tonight, I want to tell you about Mr. Esson. I have noticed him walking about with you quite frequently of late. He is all wrapped up in the little life which seems about to be snuffed out. He has more to contend with than you suppose. Be very gentle with him, and try to draw him into relationship with outdoor life as much as possible. There is a grave secret back of his present condition which will show you the necessity for doing what I have just suggested, if you ever have occasion to learn it. Good night. About 1 o'clock the next morning I was aroused by Stanton entering the room. "Get up," he said with evident agitation. "I fear that the boy has taken a turn for the worse. Go for the doctor at once. Have him make all speed. Don't go unarmed." I dressed hurriedly, pausing only to take the revolver that Stanton thrust into my hand. Then went quickly to the barn, saddled the horse, and was away on my long, perilous ride. It was well for me that I had become familiar with the neighboring roads by my aimless strolls during the boy's illness. Otherwise, as I galloped noiselessly along the deep-sanded road, I might have become confused with the pale moon and deep shadows adding strange effects to every well-known landmark. The road was winding, and for some distance led through a dense pine forest, where uncanny fears seemed to take tangible form in every shadow and lurk behind every tree. I fully appreciated the danger of the situation. 1,000 times I wished that I had sent Uncle Boston in my place. But I put the thought from me when I considered how much delay would thus have been occasioned. I remembered also that Uncle Boston was not a young man by any means. What was that stir in the leaves of the water oak under which I was riding? Was it the crouching of some catamount preparing for a leap from his leafy lair? No, it was but the breeze, the noise of which was not deadened by the moss as in the other trees. Hist! Was that the cry for help from some luckless victim of highwaymen? No, it was but the moaning of a broken branch as it rubbed against a tree. I had now arrived at the thickest of the pine forest, and involuntarily I quickened the pace of the already swift-flying steed. I took the revolver from my pocket and held it cocked in my right hand, while the left was occupied with the reins. What if I should be killed tonight, I thought, by wild beast or desperate highwayman? What had my life amounted to, anyway? So far I had been but a burden to my parents and friends, living upon their bounty, schooled at their expense, and returning only inadequate affection and no work of merit. What had I done, in fact, to make the world better by having lived? What promise had I, that if I should be spared longer than this night, that the future would be full of lofty purpose and strenuous endeavor? I had now nearly traversed the forest. I could see by the light that began to struggle more abundantly through the trees that the horse's breast was covered with foam. Suddenly my attention was arrested by the snapping of twigs at the right of the road, some distance ahead. My heart stood still as, on coming nearer, I saw a dark figure creep stealthily into the shadow of a tree. My first impulse was to turn back. No, I had come thus far, and I'd not turn back now. But a mile lay between me and the doctor's house. I was now within 3 or 4 rods of the tree behind which danger lurked. I'd let them know that I was prepared for battle. The horse snorted, shied to the extreme left of the road, and stopped short within 2 rods of the tree. "Hello there!" I shouted in a strange, unnatural tone. "Get out of this, or I'll open fire on you." No motion. Benumbing fear palsied me for a moment. I managed, however, to point my revolver at the tree and fire. The horse jumped, whirled, and started in the opposite direction. I righted him about just in time to see a dark form step from behind the tree into the road. I took dead aim. "Don't shoot, for the good law's sake," entreated a shaky voice. "I ain't done no harm to no one." Seeing that my supposed antagonist was fully as much frightened as myself, I lowered my revolver, and said in a tone containing as much bravado as I could muster, "Then what are you doing here?" "I done gone to a meetin', and it keeps so powerful late, I's just getting home," explained the negro, his teeth fairly chattering with fright. "Well, I think you'd better take care to get home earlier hereafter," said I, urging my horse past the offender, and keeping a strict watch upon him until he was well out of sight. The doctor had just returned from attending another case when I dashed into the yard. He quickly saddled a fresh steed, and together we made all haste in returning. Day was breaking as we galloped up the driveway at the Essen farm. Stanton was standing by the side of the house. His face said, even before he uttered a word, that all was over. "Hal, one thing more, and then you can catch a little rest," said Stanton. "Go over and tell Uncle Boston to borrow Squire White's gray mare, and drive to the preacher's and the undertaker's. The boy must be buried this afternoon, according to prevalent custom. Let Uncle Boston be sure to say when asking for the horse that Stanton requests it." I marveled at the strangeness of the message, but having learned to trust Stanton's judgment, I guided the tired beast along the well-known path to Uncle Boston's house. "Did Mather White say I go for the Squire's gray mare?" "Yes, Boston, that's what he said. He wished you to be sure to say that Stanton requested it." "Then I thutly go," said he, depositing his axe and dinner bucket in the hands of his overjoyed grandson, Samuel, whose voluble boastings could now scarcely equal his pride at thus being singled out as the recipient of such notable honors. Unmindful of the sorrow which hushed the great house where a little form lay very still and white, this young scion of Uncle Boston asserted his new dignity by heading a procession of his smaller brothers and sisters on a grand march around their diminutive shanty. The last I saw as I rode away was this youthful representative of the race flourishing the axe and whacking with the dinner bucket the head of one of his devotees, who did not accord him sufficient recognition of his newly acquired honors. End of Section 12.